Hey guys, my name is Third Eye and today we'll be analyzing the record history of Michael Jackson through his entire career, how his artistic choices felt with the three different labels he had to go through as a musician: Motown, Epic, and the most controversial one, Sony. But before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to my channel if you like my videos, and if you have any idea for a future video about music, comment it down below. Well, as you all know, Michael was extremely unhappy with Sony during the promotion and release of his sixth studio album, Invincible, in 2001. But how did he end up being so disappointed with the way they treated him during the album sessions? How did he end up holding banners like these protesting against Sony? Well, to answer all these questions, let's just take a retrospective look at his entire record history, which takes us back to the year 1966, back when the Jackson 5 group was on its origin. The father of Michael and his brothers, Joe Jackson, wanted to push his kids into the industry very desperately, as he could notice how incredibly talented they all were. Therefore, he decided to sign a contract with Steeltown Records, a very small label that worked very poorly as a distributor. They released a few singles, but got almost no recognition until they would sign with Motown, a well-known label, just 1 year later. This would happen because they'd be lucky enough to take part of the opening act of a performance by the Bobby Taylor and the Vancouver's band that was signed to Motown, and gave their own label the advice to cast them in after their marvelous performance. Actually, Motown had already rejected them 1 year before, but after this new advice, they decided to give them a chance. Motown was still not very convinced, so when they made their debut in 1969, they did under the name of Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5. Diana Ross was the most famous artist of Motown at that time, so they did that in hope to give them a little push into success. Well, it obviously worked. They succeeded. They had that much success that in the next 6 years the Jackson 5 would release the incredible amount of 10 albums, plus the 4 albums Michael recorded in solitaire. Out of this gross exploitation, it's a fact that the Jackson family barely got to keep the earnings, and Motown kept almost all the money made out of the sales. This happened due to the contract Joe Jackson had signed with Motown some years before, which he hadn't realized was super abusive out of his desperation to skyrocket them into fame. Motown owned the rights of all the songs and even the group's name, and out of all the earnings, the Jackson family would only receive the poor amount of 3%. Well, finally, one day this would all come to an end, as Joe would receive a call from the label Epic Records, which was gaining a lot of popularity, and offered a deal to him. When Joe came to visit the offices of the label and had some conversations with its boss, he was shook when he would end up reading the contract Joe had signed with Motown, as it would be very complicated to break. Motown would still own the song's rights and their name, so they would feel forced to change it. They renamed themselves to the Jacksons and soon started recording again. They would release a few more albums with this new label, and they would obviously not have the same repercussion as their past material anymore, but they still felt really comfortable with the amount of royalties they were getting from their hard work. Obviously, they were mostly focused on Michael, as he still was the most talented and outstanding one of the group. Motown had seen the same in him, which was the reason why they had had him record 4 more albums as a kid in solitaire. Once he became an adult, it would be his turn to shine, and that's how his debut album as an adult would see the light in 1979. Off the Wall is and will remain one of the most important albums in the history of pop music of all time, and after this immense success, Epic would slowly lose interest in the Jacksons. They would release a few more albums in the next decade, like Triumph or Victory, but they wouldn't last long since Michael had his huge solo career to attend to. Michael would release his next 2 albums, Thriller and Bad, under Epic, and he would feel completely comfortable in the creation process, as he had artistic freedom when it came to making choices, and received a great amount of money compared to what he received with Motown. Around 1988, Sony wanted to become a relevant label in the industry, so they decided to buy Epic. Suddenly, Michael would not feel that comfortable anymore, so just a few months after the purchase, he would want to leave it, and as he was not really that attached, he could perfectly do so. Obviously, Sony didn't want their biggest artists to leave the company, and they had to plan something for Michael to keep being comfortable in the label. That's exactly how they would both come to terms with a new contract signed in 1991, known as one of the most complicated in the music industry ever, in which Michael would have complete artistic freedom, would get a great percentage of the money made out of his work, and would still own all of his catalog. This contract was extremely favorable for Michael and very risky for Sony, because Michael released an album every 4 years at that time and spent a huge amount of money on everything related to it. The videos, the production, the promotion. The contract was very risky for Sony. It made practically no sense to sign it for every other artist but Michael, but they remained hopeful for his next releases. What they all didn't see coming, obviously, was all the controversies that Michael would be involved in during the next years. I'm of course talking about the allegations that the Chandler family did against Michael in 1993, accusing him of child molestation. After this gigantic turbulence in Michael's career, we end up 2 years later on 1995's History, a 2-set disc with 30 tracks combining old material and new one, which had a moderate success. In these 5 years that had passed since the contract, Michael had only released Dangerous, that was already finished when he had signed the deal, and History. The management of Sony was getting kinda worried, because they had put a lot of risk into a contract that was not benefiting the label as much as they had expected it to. That's what would push Sony to offer a new contract to Michael, which he accepted, and in which his rights management company would end up melting with Sony, creating a new company called Sony ATV. He would put his 4,000 songs catalog in there, in which, by the way, you could find all the Beatles songs, for example, and Sony put their entire catalog there as well. Therefore, half of Sony ATV would belong to Michael, and the other half to Sony. Now, with this fusion being done, it would be very difficult for Michael and Sony to leave each other, as they both owned an entire company together. From now on, things wouldn't get any better for Michael. In 1997, he would release Blood on the Dance Floor, History and the Mix, which you all know completely failed commercially, out of the confusion of the fans on if it was actually a new album or a remix one. This was all Sony's fault, and after this disaster, he didn't want to record with his label anymore, but he was stopped by the contract clauses that would force him to do his next album in 2001, Invincible. If you all want to learn about the studio sessions of that record and how it was promoted, check out this video. As Michael knew it would be his last album in long, he put an enormous amount of work on the album, which is just a notice with a quick listen of the record. He spent about $30 to $40 million on the process, which makes it the most expensive album in history, just so that Sony would barely promote it during its release. Yes, you heard right. They decided to poorly promote an album in which they had spent more than $30 million. Obviously, you can imagine how betrayed Michael felt after the sabotage of this record. But you might as well be asking yourself, why is that? Why did they decide to bury an album and make it flopped after spending so much money and time on it? Well, there's a few reasons for that. As it had cost so much money, they maybe needed to make the album profitable in some way. It was meant to have a tour but didn't, which means less money for Sony. And the last reason, which is controversial, maybe Sony needed Michael to go bankrupt. Let me explain. Michael entered the 2000s with a delicate economic situation, as him and Sony were spending absurd amounts of money on the album. If Michael Jackson went bankrupt, it would be extremely beneficial for Sony, because they would be able to buy the Michael Jackson 4,000 song catalog that had represented 50% of Sony ATV for a decent price. So if they didn't promote the album well, Michael would be forced to sell it to them to get profit again and have a stable economic situation. This would not end up happening, as the album earned a profitable amount of money to compensate its budget, although its sales were not really comparable to other MJ records. So Sony would not get the 50% of Sony ATV Michael Jackson owned, until he would pass by. The very moment he did, Sony immediately offered a great amount of money to his family, which they accepted. After so much time, Sony would finally manage to get away with it, and actually, there's lots of people who speculate Michael was murdered so that Sony could buy MJ's catalog for a cheaper price. But let's just put all the conspiracy theories behind it and leave them for another video, because trust me, there's loads of things to talk about when it comes to his death. Well, that's about it regarding Michael's record history with Motown, Epic and Sony. I hope that by telling you this entire story, you learned how it works for an artist to be part of a label, especially for Michael, who had things really favorable at the beginning, but then it all started to crumble down for him. Until next week, bye, see you around.
So, I own half of Sony's publishing and I'm leaving them, and they're very angry at me because of it, but I just did good business, you know. But so the way they get revenge is to try and destroy my album. And Tommy Mottola is a devil. I'm not supposed to say what I'm gonna say right now, but I have to let you in on a secret.
Say it.
Mariah Carey, after divorcing Tommy, came to me crying. She was crying so badly I had to hold her. And she said to me that this is an evil man. And Michael, this man follows me, she said, and he's very, very evil, and she doesn't trust him. And he is a horrible human being, and we have to continue our drive until he's terminated. I just want you to know I appreciate everything you've done. You've been amazing. You're so loyal, Diana, everybody, Waldo, all the people here. I love you all.